telecommunications network is firing off emails in the middle of the night saying, you have to shape your coverage this way or that way in order to reflect my personal agenda and need to deliver profit to the shareholders of Bell Canada. So that's good news. You're allowed to smile. But of course, just because he's the epitome of reptilian media corporation overlords and happened to lose his job, doesn't mean that the problem itself has gone away. So I've downloaded this really corny template from some website, so bear with me. But I want to take you way back to the origins of this vertical integration that got us in so much trouble, got Kevin Krull in so much trouble at Bell Media. So thinking back to the 1500s and the advent of printing presses, as Pope Pius X, I think, was it? I don't know. Does anybody know their Catholic 16th century Catholic Church history better than me? Who was the guy that Martin Luther was really mad at? Pius X, I think. So the problem was that there's these Catholic cardinals basically selling indulgences. They said as soon as the coin in the box rings, the soul henceforth from purgatory springs, some cheesy rhyme. It's been 500 years, forgive me if I forget. But that was not cool, obviously. So they were trying to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and they were funding it by basically suckering these people into believing that their relatives would get out of purgatory if they donated money to the Catholic Church. So some reformers got really angry. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the wall, or to the door of the church. Oh my God, this is why I'm not a history teacher. News reporters and facts sometimes... Facts don't enter into it, but I'm going to do my best tonight. The point I'm trying to make is that the people who owned the printing presses were really sympathetic to Martin Luther and his reforms. And what the Catholic Church found out is that when you have a bunch of underground radicals who own printing presses, you're in big trouble. And so Martin Luther's campaign is sort of humorously referred to as the first truly viral social media campaign, because from that moment on the steps of the church, his message spread like wildfire through Germany. Basically, they translated all of this Latin into the vernacular, into German, and then these printing presses would run off 1,000 copies at a time in the middle of the night, hand them out to people, like peddlers, people carrying tin pots from town to town who would go into the next town, and this is where the term viral comes from, spread that infection, spread that idea to the populace. It's also the birth of vertical integration in media, because once you control the means of production, once you control the access point by which people get ideas, there's a huge amount of power there, and thus began sort of a 500-year grab for both the wires and the content that's produced over them. And so it reached a zenith, I would say, in Quebec in the last few years. Another made-up newspaper. If you don't speak French, that's not a problem. It just says this is not an iPhone, it's a joke. But there's a company called Quebecor in Quebec City or in Quebec that I competed against as an employee of Kevin Krull at Bell, and we got into a nasty spat over a hockey arena, but that's a story for another time. And so Quebecor has penetration in Quebec into 90% of the market. They literally print the textbooks that your children read at school, all the way up to all the daily newspapers and weekly newspapers, 9 out of 10 magazines you see at the grocery store, half the radio stations, 28 out of the 30 most popular television shows are produced by the same company, which was controlled by a particularly ideological dude named Pierre-Carl Pelledeau, who is now running for leadership of the Parti Québécois. But at the time, there's a funny story that came out in 2011 about an internal memo banning iPhones from all of the television dramas across the Quebecor network. And the reason was because their telecommunications division didn't have a license to sell iPhones. And so they erased Apple products from the fictional world of their television dramas and from the news coverage and from the newsrooms that their reporters worked in. And so if you were a Quebecor reporter, you had to carry a BlackBerry or an Android phone. And if you were watching television and you only watched Quebecor shows, you wouldn't know that iPhones existed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you don't know what you don't know. So if you speak French and you live in Quebec and you watch the shows you like and you watch the hockey game and you read the paper that comes to the doorstep every morning, it might not occur to you that somebody actually thought about how to control what you think about and what you don't think about. And I think more dangerous than just the obvious profit imperative is the fact that when you have that kind of market saturation, when you have that kind of control, you can literally prevent people from having thoughts that they might not otherwise have. Or you can prevent people from having certain thoughts. And that's exactly the situation that people in Germany in the 16th century found themselves in under the Catholic Church. So, not that much has changed, I guess. So what is the alternative? If that is the sort of logic, if that's where all of these big media companies are going, is complete market integration, Quebecor refers to its customers in their annual reports as revenue generating units. How many revenue generating units do we have in our network? You picture the Matrix and like little people just plugged into battery cells in the wall. So if that is the sort of end logic of these big media companies, the question is what is the alternative? And we hear a lot about social media and the great powers of social media. So I just grabbed a screenshot today of my own Twitter account. Have you ever looked at somebody else's Facebook page? I find it really weird because you think, oh, this is what Facebook looks like to you, because these are your friends. These are their perspectives. This is your uncle with the dirty jokes. I have my own, so Facebook and Twitter look totally different to me. And because I can choose who I follow and who I don't follow, I can literally control which perspectives and which ideas infiltrate my consciousness on a daily basis. It just so happens, and this is a total coincidence, that the top tweet when I screen grabbed this is Julie Snyder, who is married to the CEO of Quebecor, the guy who created that huge media empire in Quebec. But I follow her because she's interesting. So when you have a social feed that you can just unfollow anybody whose perspective irks you, and where you have algorithmic marketing that is basically targeting stuff at you based on your other browsing habits and based on other little tidbits they can buy or glean about your online life, the question is, how is that any freer than a world in which Pierre-Carl Pelado decides what you see from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night? I mean, basically, it's a prison of your own making. And I find that when I'm on social media, I really have to make an effort to get outside that bubble of people that are going to basically offer me validation for my ideas because they're my friends, right? And it's hard to have a healthy debate over Twitter because you're working with 140 characters. And so most often the reaction is just to shut somebody down in frustration and block them rather than have a conversation. And so my question, is this going to save democracy? I'm not being totally facetious. I think we've invested a lot of energy into this idea of social media as a kind of revolutionary force, but I think that the end point is a dark one. I think there's a dark side to social media that doesn't often get talked about when we celebrate the Egyptian Revolution or the Arab Spring. So, the last thing is, of course, it isolates you and depresses you and makes you easier to market to, so it's helpful in that regard as well. So, why become a journalist? If you'll forgive me, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself here. It's a crime in news writing, but now that I'm not a news reporter anymore, I can share a little bit. So this is Main Island. Anyone spend any time in the Gulf Islands? So my family's been on the coast for 4 generations, and that is now the mainmast inn. It's still standing on Main Island. And that's my grandfather John and his brothers and sisters, mom and dad, and this was taken in the early 1940s. After Pearl Harbor, of course, all of that was taken away and auctioned off. This is the camp that my grandma ended up in Tashme, which is above Hope, from 1942 to 1946. So growing up, I was not allowed to get away from this story, right? My job was to remember the story and to never let it happen again. And so I often asked my mom's parents, because my dad's family is Japanese, but my mom's family, they're also 4th generation, but they're English-Scottish. And I said, well, how did you let this happen? How could this possibly have gone on with decent, democracy-loving neighbors and citizens all around? And my grandfather's answer was we just didn't have any information. we didn't know what was going on. There was a war on. There was one thing on the radio and there was one newspaper. And basically, if you picked up the newspaper, you knew that Japanese were dangerous enemy aliens. And if you listened to the radio, there was like submarines off of the coast. And we were all going to wake up with a katana across our throats the next day. So I'm sorry, but we had no other perspectives. There was no conversation about this. It was just what the government said was happening, and that was all we had. And so this is my grandma now. She's 91. That's in Burnaby, and she raised me not only to recognize that our rights are conditional, and that our relationship with the federal government is such that if you don't fight for and defend your rights and the rights of other people around you, specifically Muslims since 9/11, First Nations for the last 300 years, that's not something you can take for granted. And so I don't think it's a stretch to say that's what drove me into journalism. The combination of my grandfather saying there wasn't any good information, bad stuff happens when people don't have information, and my grandmother saying you've got to be a storyteller, you've got to remember this stuff, you've got to pass it along, it seemed like a logical place to go in terms of a career. So there was nobody prouder than my grandma to see me pop up on television. I had a whole bunch of fans in the Japanese Anglican church basement in Toronto when I was at the CBC, and every time I'd go visit my great aunt, I'd have crustless cucumber sandwiches in the church basement and answer questions about Stephen Harper. But what I realized is that I had this big audience, and of course the bigger your audience, the narrower the spectrum of acceptable opinions and thoughts. And so it's this devil's bargain, right? And I was young and the money was good and I was having fun and working with great people, but I realized that the end point of all of this, if I wasn't making Kevin Krull more money this year than I was the year before, that was it. Like, there was no room in that equation for social change, for other economic models, for thoughts that were not already part of the existing lexicon. And so I left. So in 2011, this is from a National Post article. My friend Francis shot the photo. And self-focus, entitlement, and very open online lives are the ingredients for public resignation. It's from the National Post. I think they ran 11 hit pieces attacking my decision to leave television news. I don't know why they were so obsessed, but like a dog with a bone, they couldn't let go. And actually, what's kind of sad is that most of them don't have jobs anymore. So literally, my most vicious critic at the National Post lost her job there and ended up at Sun News, and now that network is no longer. So I'm not celebrating it. I'm not trying to be cruel about it. It's just that that's where the industry's gone since. So I left in 2011, about 3 years after the recession, and anybody who works in media now can tell you the story, but basically since then it's been a total meltdown, especially in the private sector. This is another fake newspaper, but yeah, I mean, you don't have to wait very long for another story of a newspaper either shutting down in a small community or more layoffs at a big news organization. And so something's broken in the model that this industry is built on, and the big newspapers and media companies are scrambling to try to find ways to get people to pay for news content. But by and large, the trend is not good. So there are some models that are working. There are some news brands that are doing better than they were 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But overall, the trend is down. And I would say that's why I don't celebrate the demise of networks like Sun News, even though I found a lot of the perspectives that they put on air pretty questionable. I think that journalists losing their jobs is a bad thing, and here's why. Because when you start to overall erode the media landscape, you justify cuts to public broadcasting. And so there's this interesting relationship between public broadcasting and the private news industry where they sort of keep each other honest, because they're all competing for the same viewers in the same market. But if you cut the knees out of CBC and they don't have any resources to do investigative reporting, there's no reason for any of the private networks to invest in that kind of coverage either. And if you have a government in Ottawa that watches this wholesale slaughter across the news industry, they say, well, why would we be paying public money to fund a news organization that makes the other ones look bad? So it's sort of like this vicious circle whereby the deeper the cuts at the CBC, the worse the coverage gets, both on the public and private networks. So, who steps into that vacuum? Because somebody does. Right? It's not like we have fewer than 24 hours in a day. I know it feels like we do, but we still have curiosity, we still have an appetite for information, we still have an appetite for connection, and so there's a whole bunch of forces conspiring to step into that vacuum. I don't mean to just stand here and rant at you. If you have thoughts or ideas, I'd rather not just keep all that to the end. Who have you noticed? I mean, here in Powell River, if you imagine the CBC 20 years ago and the newspapers and how thick they were on a Saturday 20 years ago, what has stepped in to fill that vacuum?
Hollywood.
Yeah, for sure. Entertainment?
Social media.
Yeah. Which, as discussed, can be it can be a good thing, or it can be a terribly bad thing.
I think with social media, there's a lot more people inventing things as opposed to investigative journalism. And so there are a lot of opinions being thrown out around, like places like Facebook, for instance. I get a million Facebook things into my inbox every day, and they're just funny little waste of space things and opinions.
That's a key point, right? Opinion instead of information or instead of facts. And the thing about Facebook is, yeah, you might be a trained journalist. You might go on and say, okay, I was stopped by this police officer at the corner, and then he dragged me out of my car and he beat me, and here's all these eyewitnesses, and you could actually write that up as like a Facebook post. But most Facebook posts are not of that caliber, right? Most of them you're going to have to take with a grain of salt. So what you end up with is a bunch of contradictory personal opinion, and you can either latch onto a position and then just reinforce that by only listening to other people that feel the same way, or you can just say, oh, they're all liars, or I don't know where the truth is, and you can just sort of disengage. The other people that step into the vacuum, of course, are marketers and political parties, which are devoting incredible amounts of resources, both their own and those that they steal from taxpayers and funnel through government departments, into creating these very robust communications wings that basically replace the work that a lot of journalists used to do. In Victoria right now, there's 225 professional full-time comm staffers working at the legislature. There are like 4 people who attend press briefings on a daily basis from the gallery. Like, you think about the imbalance, and journalists are getting totally outgunned. And some of them are realizing that there's really no money to be made in journalism anyway, and so they've just kind of thrown in the towel. Oh, that's too bad. Pamela Martin is a former news anchor who went to work for the BC Liberals, and now she does fake news reports where she interviews the Premier for the benefit of the party supporters. But do you think she asks any tough questions? It's too bad I can't get this to play. Oh well, we don't have Wi-Fi here. That's all. It's not a problem. You can look it up though. Pamela Martin, Christy Clark, and just like throw your slippers at the computer as you watch a former news anchor just sell out to a political party. The sort of epitome, I would say, of this art form is the Prime Minister's personal news service 24/7, which is your taxpayer-funded daily digest of all things camouflage and Stephen Harper. And it's this unfiltered propaganda stream, paid for and justified as government communications, that is in some cases now being used by news organizations as B-roll because they don't have the resources to actually send a camera to cover military exercises or Arctic sovereignty or what have you. And so we started seeing this in the last couple of elections. The footage that you're watching and the angles you're seeing, Stephen Harper has kind of a big belly, so you want to make sure that he's on this side of the podium and that he's filmed from his good side, and what you're seeing on the news has all been shot by government comms people. So that's sort of where we're at. So, kind of makes me want to just squirt ketchup on a burger. I don't know. This is what I found when I Googled sad man. So I just wanted to put 3 ideas forward today before we get into the discussion about what we can do to push back against this trend. And so they're not particularly radical ideas, they're actually kind of old-fashioned. One of them is to pay for content to support outlets that are doing good work, because we've gotten so used to content being free that sometimes it's hard to remind ourselves that good original news reporting doesn't pay for itself. Vote for public broadcasting and organize. I'm going to get to that last point last. But as an example, here in BC, we've got an outlet called the Tyee, full disclosure. I used to write for them. I still contribute op-eds. They're doing something that nobody else is doing, and they are funding it in some pretty interesting ways. So they just wrapped up this crowdfunding campaign where they ask people to become Tyee builders, they're called. What that means is it's a monthly donor. It's essentially a magazine subscription, except that the content gets shared with anybody who wants to access it online. So you don't get a physical piece of paper delivered to you that is your own that you can then recycle or use in other ways. It's something that you're paying for that is sort of for the broader good, and the more resources they have to hire journalists, the better quality and the larger variety of stories they can cover. So this is the headline today. Suck it up, progressives, we need a coalition now. Did you write that?
I could have, but I didn't.
Okay. Voting for public broadcasting is another interesting one. Just because the first slide had Trudeau and Melchior, I'm covering my butt here by making sure Elizabeth May is on one of the slides. But Friends of Canadian Broadcasting is doing some really interesting work in this election. They have taken some serious criticism for this, but they are unabashedly jumping into the federal election and differentiating the positions of the different parties and candidates in terms of their attitude towards public broadcasting. And so if there's no political mandate to fund the CBC, you can bet that governments are going to have no reason in future to increase funding. Yeah.
So I don't understand why we support public broadcasting when people like Peter Mansbridge are making speeches to the oil and gas company and misrepresenting what goes on, such as the recent example in English Bay.
Yeah, I think you can criticize individual departments or news anchors and still support the idea of public broadcasting. I mean, I find it pretty galling as a former, CBC employee that the guy gets paid $400,000 a year and that's not enough, so he's got to go and top up by giving speeches to Cap. Absolutely, and that is unfortunately that was a practice that grew out of the culture in CBC after they brought in a bunch of folks from the big private TV networks who relaxed some of the rules in order to draw higher priced talent away from those other networks and compete with them. So the reason given for the high salaries is that those people have to have salaries competitive with what they would get at CTV or Global so that they don't just walk out the door. As for the speaking fees, that has been a real disappointment. As both a viewer and a former CBC employee, I think the idea that you would just compromise your reputation in your journalism for $5,000 or $10,000 is kind of pathetic, but that is the system that they were told was okay, and so a lot of them took advantage of it. So that said, I think that you can still agree that further cuts to the CBC are not going to solve the problem of news anchors going to speak for the oil industry. And the more weakened the CBC becomes, the less oversight there is internally, and the less anybody cares because they're just trying to save the furniture rather than rehabilitate the reputation of the network itself. So I hear your point, but I think that it's still a good idea to tell politicians that you support the idea of a robust public broadcaster. And the very last thing I wanted to talk about speaks to the work that I do now with my colleague Dave Mills, who's at the back. And I just wanted to share some weekday circulation numbers with you. So these newspaper numbers are a couple years old. The National Post has a paid weekday circulation of 93,000 people across the country. The Province, 99,000. Vancouver Sun, 120,000. Dogwood Initiative's mailing list is up over 215,000 now. The Globe and Mail has 260. Open Media has more than 300,000 people on their list. And Lead Now has more than 360,000 people. So there's a shift in power that I think comes about once you, going back to the 16th century and the guys with the printing presses, and they were mostly guys. Sorry. There is something shifting now where Lead Now does a lot on basically democratic reform and the various issues connected to that. Open Media fights for a free and open internet. Dogwood Initiative has been really active on the oil tanker issue. And on those issues, I get people coming up to me all the time who say, you know, I get my news from you. It's horrible to say, but on this particular issue, you're what I read. And that's a huge responsibility. And it's not an ideal situation in a democracy that you're getting your news from Ingos, but that is where we're at. And so you've got these groups that were not conceived as broadcasting platforms or media companies that are stepping into this vacuum and trying to compete with political parties, trying to compete with marketers, and trying to compete with mainstream news agencies for the ownership of the story, of the truth. And so we saw, you know, you can put out a nasty editorial in the National Post, but it now reaches fewer than half the people that I can reach. Literally, I could get up and have a mimosa and read an email and no, there's some checks and balances, but there are more people that we can now reach in BC than either the two major daily newspapers, and I think that is a huge turning point. So that's why we're using that platform to inform people about their candidates in the upcoming federal election. The kind of stuff that newspapers used to do, groups like Dogwood Initiative are now stepping into. So we're actually crowdfunding money to run independent polling in ridings like this one, which we will share for free with people in the riding so that they have an idea what is going on, because the newspapers don't have the budget to do it. And in terms of getting your candidates to actually answer questions, when you have a group of that size behind you and you show up in their office and say, hey, we've got some questions about your vote on this issue or your stance on that issue, they actually answer the phone. They let Dogwood Initiative organizers show up in their office and interview them, because they know that that's going out to a bigger audience than they would reach just by speaking to the local paper. So I think we're at a really interesting tipping point. I'd like to hear from you whether some of this makes you as uncomfortable as it makes me. But I think it's worth digging into and talking about. And I'm here to answer any questions I can about both where we've been and the experience that I've got in the media world and where I think we're going and the work we're doing in terms of federal election organizing. So that's all I've got prepared, but I'm quite happy to stick around for as long as you would like.
That would be lovely. We have organised 3 local media people to speak, and then we're going to have open questions, so if you'd be happy to wait for some questions.
Absolutely.
Then that would work beautifully.
And
Okay, our first... No, I hate it. Thank you. Okay, our first local representative is Druin Young. Druin is a familiar face around town and has lived in PowellRiver all her life. She has worked for every level of government in PowellRiver and appreciates the important role that democratic government plays in people's lives. Her kickstart into journalism began as a reporter with the PowellRiver News, with Joyce Carlson as publisher. She also wrote a popular weekly column, Inside Trash, for The Peak for a number of years. Druin is keenly interested in people and politics, so her latest endeavour, PowellRiverDailyNews.com, is a natural progression of interest for her. She says it's a learning experience that constantly challenges her and helps her to keep current and stay informed. So we're happy to welcome her. Claudia Medina is a local filmmaker and visual artist who has long been passionate about the power and importance of independent media. She began her media career through work at the National Film Board and continues to explore themes of community building, ecology, cultural traditions, and redefining economics in her work as a filmmaker and a citizen. She currently sits on the board of CJMP Local Community Radio. And our third local personality is Joyce Carlson. Joyce was born and raised in PowellRiver, as was her father. Her grandfather came here in 1916. She's local. She has been in the newspaper business since the late 60s. She began writing sports reports, then moved up the editorial line to be publisher of the PowellRiver News. She, when I lost the place, she publisher of the Gulf Island Driftwood. Who remembers that, the Gulf Island Driftwood? I had to think. On BC Community Newspaper Board for 25 years, the Canadian National Community Papers Board for 9 years, and she served as president for both of those organisations for a time. When people ask Joyce what she does, she says that every week she rearranges the 26 letters of the alphabet. So, if those three people could come up, they've got approximately 5-6 minutes each to speak. So whoever's up here first gets to speak first. Julie, come on, don't rush. I don't know if I ask somebody else, and I'm going to feel it.
You can crank the lights up over there.
The lights.
Crank the lights up.
And we'd like to thank these three people very much for joining us here tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate. So, wouldn't it be great if everything was black and white? So when Murray asked me about this, and I started thinking about democracy, which of course is the power of the people, and direct democracy, which was practiced many, many years ago when people at times voted with their black and their white. They happened to be men, of course, as was mentioned by Ty with regard to who controls a lot of the printing in the early 1500s. So when people had direct democracy and they all went out and they decided to discuss issues and vote on them, they had to be people who had leisure time, which typically meant they had slaves at home doing the work, some of whom were women, some were men. And that naturally evolved over the years to, municipal councils and parliaments and the estates of the realms. Communication used to be on clay tablets or papyrus, scrolls, manuscripts, paper and ink, and now digital. And Ty also mentioned about the printing press that was invented by Johannes Gutenberg. Actually, the Chinese had something going for them about 600 AD, but they had a technique with wooden blocks and paper, but with 10,000 characters, it was a bit of a laborious process. As English only has 26 letters in the alphabet, it was much easier to work with. So when I started in the newspaper business, actually, they had a linotype in the back. So a lot of people don't know what that is, but it's a machine that created lines of type. At one time, they actually did letter by letter, but this was a progressive thing that you had a linotype, and they had lead pigs, they called them, and they melted the lead down and they made this. So people were very talented because they read upside down and backwards. But if you ever knocked that tray over, it was a problem. I started working in the newspaper business on a Remington typewriter. Then we had computers, we had punch tape that helped create the papers. We got desktop computers. We had an old 4-unit community Goss press, which could print a maximum of 8 pages at a time. So oftentimes we'd have like a 5-section paper in order to get all the printing done that we did. So when we started the Peak, it was pretty exciting to start, and we would lay everything out and paste it up, and then pretty soon we did those pages digitally and sent them off electronically. So our newspaper was, the Peak was I started it in November 1995, the first issue came out, so this year we'll celebrate 20 years. I can hardly imagine that's happened. And we were actually one of the first community newspapers in Canada to have a website. So we started that in 1998, and a lot of other publishers would ask, like, Joyce, why are you doing this? And I said, well, because I can see what's going to happen and you need to be prepared. So we get about between 15,000 and 17,000 unique visitors to our website every month. In fact, in March we had 16,888. We're on Facebook and we're on Twitter and Instagram, and that really does change the pace of what happens in the newsroom. I mean, before you would write your story, because it's a community newspaper, not a daily, so you'd write the story and then you really didn't have any avenue until the next week. But now you can change things very quickly. That puts a lot of pressure on writers. And very few businesses had websites, and businesses didn't have email address programs now where they can just communicate with the customers that they already have. So things are quite different then. So with the Peak, we have our subscribers, we have our shopper readers, we have our Facebook friends. I think we're at 2,200 and something, and we don't buy them. Do you know that you can buy your friends on Facebook? So if you hear of somebody who has like 30 million friends, it's because they buy them. You know, they're not really true friends, are they? So the thing about newspapers is when a lot of things that happen, and we're not really just newspapers, not just ink on paper anymore. We're also actually, part of that digital world. And the thing is that newspaper brands have a trust factor. So I think Ty also mentioned something about, one of the audience members mentioned that you can see something on Facebook and, it could, how do you know it's true? But if it's written in your local newspaper, that newspaper has spent the time and resources to make sure that the information that they do publish is correct. So that's a pretty important factor. And also to try to make sure that you have both sides of a story. And since we started the Peak, we have a policy with letters to the editor that they need to be about a story that's been published. Because oftentimes people would write a letter to the editor only because they thought, well, if I write this letter to the editor, I'm only going to get my side in, and my side's the only side I care about. And so we would take that letter and turn it into a story and have both sides, if it's a kind of story that has an issue. But if you want your very own opinion, you can write a viewpoint, and that's fine. So democracy is messy. It's a messy system. And you find yourself at times defending a person's right to say something that you don't agree with. And that's really sometimes difficult for people. I've been in that position myself on occasion. And provided it's not libelous, like people are entitled to their opinions, and it should be, put somewhere where a lot of people can see it. And so I've learned in my career that you don't pay too many attentions to threats to sue until the subpoena comes in the door. That's when you can. Because I don't know if everybody knows, but when you're the publisher, if you publish something and you also go to court with the person whose name is on the bottom of that. So my concern now with things like Facebook and the whole marketing issue, you see on Facebook, this happened at the wedding and you'll never guess what happened next. Click here to find out. It's all marketing. It's all manipulation of people and so many people are just freely allowing that to happen to themselves. Not thinking, I would think. So my concern is what some of the things that the internet is bringing, that Ty also mentioned, kind of the dark side, is silos of conformity. So if you have an idea, it doesn't matter how outlandish it is, I'm sure that you can find people who support that idea or conspiracy theory or anything. And I worry that people are starting to not be open to other ideas, not be opening to listen to something else that maybe they hadn't thought about before. So they before you would, work out in the fields perhaps in the Middle Ages, and you would talk to different people, or you would sit in a pub, or you, even within other circumstances. So now you don't even have to be around people. You just have to be in a dark room with a computer, and you can just feed your beliefs without thinking. And I find that kind of scary. Democracy requires an informed electorate, and community newspapers and their electronic publication provide information. And that's, again, what Ty said, information is crucial. Like when the Gutenberg printing press came about, that's what it allowed people to do. Before, only certain people were allowed to read, and that was kept close by the church and by the kings and the lords, but to have information available so that people started to learn, and then learning increased, and people were able to share and understand things more than they had been. And so my other thing is that really we can talk about any kind of method of delivery that we want to talk about. But if people choose to be ignorant, and by that I mean lacking in knowledge, it really doesn't matter what the method is for delivering information. It can't overcome that closed mind mentality. So I'm a believer in information and in hearing and learning about things that you might not really agree with. But I used to say to myself on January 1st, so this year my New Year's resolution is I want to be a fanatic. Because if you're a fanatic, you don't have to listen to anybody else. You can just be a fanatic. But I've never been able to accomplish that resolution. So, thank you.
All right, 2 hard acts to follow here. Joyce was my publisher when I started out in journalism, and she took me on as a young 20-something, and I found myself writing sports. Didn't know what a blue line was all about, but people like my sports writing, and I always thank Joyce for opening up my heart and mind to journalism and swallowing my fear and getting out there and doing things like, those 5 pictures that you see in the Peak. I used to have to do that. Go out on a Sunday afternoon and ask 5 strangers a question that Joyce asked me to ask them. So it wasn't even a question I got to make up. I always found that really, really hard work. So when I read the Peak and I see those 5 pictures, I admire the person who's gone out there. I just solicit my friends and say, shut up, I'm taking your photograph, I'll make up the opinion. And then they'd laugh like crazy because they'd give me the opinion, but it was hard work. I've written most of my adult life. I really like writing. When I traveled with my kids to different countries, I'd always find an English publication to piggyback onto. I was sent out into the countryside one time to find a weeping statue. She was supposed to be weeping blood. I think she was weeping rust, personally. But while I was out there, I noticed this man walking around a field with this weird basket thing hanging off his side. So I went over and asked him what that was all about. And he was actually a knitter. So he took me to his house. And his wife, she did all the fancy work up top, and he did all the bodies and the arms during the day while he was out taking care of the sheep. So that started my sort of international career of going out and just soliciting stories from people, ordinary people, and what they were doing. And I really enjoyed that part of journalism. Just about a year ago, I've done tons of stuff since the time I worked with Joyce. I've worked all over the place in PowellRiver here. But about a year and a half ago, a friend of mine came to visit, and he had started a news blog in the interior. And I thought arrogantly, oh, I could do that off the side of my desk, because I was fully employed at that time, and not really appreciating just how much work it was. But 2 weeks later, when I lost my job at the wellness center, when they closed the doors, I kind of gave myself a pat on the back and thought I was pretty smart to start something before knowing that I was going to lose my job. And so I just threw myself into it, and I started writing stories, taking photographs, going out and talking to people. And this is my town. I know a lot of people, and I know I've got big interests in what's going on at all different levels. So it, at first flush, wasn't sort of like all that difficult. But it's become more and more work, and I find myself spending more and more hours doing it because it's really important to me what we end up talking about. And I do cover all sorts of interesting things, sometimes a bit of sports even. Although I really like that Julie Andrews, Sound of Music, when she's on the mountaintop going la la la, and it says underneath, this is what I think about sports, because that's really where my heart is at. But I think, okay, this is a hockey town, I've got to kind of do what other people do here, so I actually asked Alex Ronsby if I could post his Kings of the Castle. So that was kind of like my way around having to know what a blue line was all about. I just get Alex to, I reblog his posts, and that's pretty handy. It's been 14 months now since I started doing this, and I'm still engaged. Like I said, I'm working longer and longer hours every day, trying to get to the bottom of more stories, realizing how little I know about a lot of things, and digging deeper and deeper. And I really think that this is my niche. I went to Australia not long ago, and while I was there, a couple of friends texted me and said that they wanted to get involved with the Stop Bill C-51, the secret police bill, and could I cover it for them? And I was like, sure, but I'm in Bunbury, Australia. But no problem, because with social media and with blogging and computers, you can stay in touch with people pretty easily. So they put it on their Facebooks, and then they phoned or texted me a couple days later and said, well, forget it. We didn't get a very good response. Nobody's really interested. And I was like, no, wait. I've got hundreds of people that read my blog every day. Let's just put a place, a date, and a time and see what will happen. So they did that, and surprise, surprise, 60 people showed up for that rally, which was pretty awesome. And even like CD Saturday called to say, well, it conflicts with our date. We've got CD Saturday happening at that time. And so people talked amongst themselves on texting back and forth, and they just said, well, why don't you all come to the rally then? Because the more people, the better. And after all, if next time round Monsanto is talking about seed monopoly and you want to, gather and have some sort of rally to speak against it, you might not be allowed to legally, so you'd better come to the rally and support. What comes first, right? What cause, surpasses another cause? So in that case, some people ended up attending both, and that was a good thing. And somebody took a photograph, and there I was in my daughter's living room, plunking away on my computer, and I posted it from halfway around the world, and that was done. So that was pretty awesome. I've stayed in touch with lots of my friends that I developed when I was doing the international education program with Brooks School. So I talked to people and not talk to them, but text with them, and email back and forth. And, Hong Kong and Japan and Tehran. And my friends are always amazed at, what do you mean you started your own news blog? Like, how do you do that? Well, you just get yourself a WordPress site and start taking pictures and posting it, and people share it. And before you know it, you've got 60, and then you've got 100, and then you've got 500, and then you've got 700, and then you've got 1,000. And, sometimes when something really different happens, like during the civic elections last November, thousands of people were checking in to see what was going on. And there was a discussion that was happening behind the scenes that was really awesome. And I just happened to be the person that accepted the comments, but all of you folks were the ones that were keeping it going and keeping your neighbors' interest in the subject matter more than I was. So that was kind of a neat phenomenon to watch, that the town really can pick up and get involved and discuss matters, and all I had to do was facilitate to a certain degree. Of course, I read all the time. And like Kai said a minute ago, right, my go-to in the morning is the Tyee, #1, rabble.ca, #2. I check out the Dogwood Initiative every single day. I go to different Facebook pages of our MLA or Lana Popham, people that I think have an interesting perspective. And I don't really read the post media publications at all. I do have a subscription to The Sun because I think it's important to kind of see occasionally what they're up to. But I read recently that the Post Media took over the Sun Media, and I think we're down to like maybe 2 or 3 corporations that own all the daily newspapers across Canada. And so how does that work? Well, one of the ways it works is that CAP, which is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, I think, recently put out this Prezi presentation that said that they're going to work hand in hand with Post Media, and they're going to supply all the content, and they're going to like put a sunny face on the energy needs of Canadians. Now, some people might say, well, they deserve the right to do so, and other people may not like that so much. So really, we can exercise our own personal choices, and we don't have to read it. We don't have to pick it up if we don't want to. Like when I worked for the waste reduction program, and I would go into the supermarkets and say, look at all this packaging. This is appalling. That box of cereal comes with, cardboard on the outside and paper on the inside, and then this liner. And the guy said, so don't buy it if you don't like it. Like, you consumers have an enormous amount of power. If you don't like it, don't purchase it. Whoever is, making the shampoo, that when you pick it up, it doesn't have the Mobius loop on the bottom, so you can't recycle it. If you don't purchase that stuff, eventually they're going to figure out that there's a reason why people aren't buying their product, and they'll change. So I sort of adopt that kind of attitude towards what I read. For about, 15 years, when I was a rabid feminist back in the 70s and 80s, I didn't read anything that men said or read or wrote. Right? And then after a while, it's like Edward Rutherford put out a new book, and it's just like, don't look at it, Droon. I know you want to read it, but he's a man, right? And it took me, aging and progressing through all the changes that you go through as you realize they're not the enemy, and oh my God, we're in the same camp actually, to finally, allow myself now to read whatever I want to read. But that also extends to allowing myself not to read what I don't want to read. So I pick and choose what I want to read, and perhaps, like Kai said, maybe I need to keep a bit more of an open mind. Maybe I am sort of like just feeding myself the stuff that I want to read. But on the other hand, if I go ballistic and my blood pressure goes up because I read something about CAP influencing Post Media, that kind of makes me a bit annoyed. When I was in Australia recently, my daughter said to me, ever since her father-in-law retired, and he watches nothing but CNN, and she said, I'm so sick of CNN. Everything that comes out of his mouth is something that he has picked up off CNN. He has no other perspective at all, but he's a walking book of authority on everything that CNN talks about, right? And I was like, oh God, as we get older, you got to be careful of that kind of stuff. So, all right, note to self: don't just preach the stuff that is in your camp, right? Like, try to keep an open mind. And I think my finishing point here in all of this is that I think PowellRiver's got so many fascinating and interesting people, and the role of a journalist, I think, in this town is to bring as much as we can to the forefront so that people can just sort of taste the flavor of this incredible community that we live in. And the young people in this community right now are absolutely awesome, I think. I was an old hippie in the 70s, and we were all into gardening and doing all the kind of stuff that the young people are doing nowadays. But they're doing it with this extra flavor and this political fervor, and I really salute them, and I think that we need to support them. And as an older person myself, I think that we have to be careful that we're not full of the whole doomsday message, right? Like, there's lots of good stuff happening, and if you read history like I do, shit happens all the time, and regimes come in and regimes go out, and the common people live their lives. So while we commonly live our lives, I want to just keep on writing for you guys, and I totally appreciate your support. And I want to applaud the younger people amongst us who are kind of like carrying the banner forward, and like Kai and the news that he's doing, and Dogwood Initiative, awesome job that they're doing. Tanker Free BC, another awesome group that's working really hard to keep our ocean ways clean. And I think you can probably tell me a few more initiatives that you're involved in too, but I think, let's see if I have something wise to say at the end. I think I tried to come up with something. Yes, well, the desiderata, right? Everybody knows a desiderata, right? So I just want to remind myself every day that the world is truly unfolding the way it should. And this is it. We are where we are because we're supposed to be here. Thank you.
thank you to both of you for all that wonderful perspective. And I just wanted to thank Kai for giving us a lowdown on the dismal state of the mainstream media, but also for proposing the alternatives. And the list that you gave actually lightened the heavy feeling in my chest after seeing a lot of that information and hearing a lot about what people are doing independently. And I think that the answer really for me lies in the sense of independence. And I'm here as a representative of our local community radio, CJMP 90.1, which if you haven't tuned in, I urge you to do so. And I'll get more into that in a moment, but before that, I wanted to sort of revisit the concept of democracy. We're here tonight to discuss media democracy, and I was thinking a lot about the concept, and for me, it's almost like there's a need in myself, anyway, to reclaim that word and sort of kind of crack it open and kind of extract the juices of what I think is the potent aspect of democracy, which is basically regaining a sense of participation, a sense of engagement, and a sense of sharing and knowledge, rather than purely a concept that's about going to the polls or voting, often for inadequate choices. And so it's about being informed, as it was mentioned before, but it's also about connecting with our sense of responsibility as citizens and engaging with each other. And to me, that means a lot in terms of celebrating and actually listening to the plurality of voices that are out there. And as you mentioned earlier, there's such a concentration now that you really have a hard time understanding that there are plurality of voices. There are people out there doing the work, and there are people that are actually doing analysis and connecting the dots. And as you mentioned, there are starting to become, there's a desire and a thirst for people to look for that information as we become more aware how limiting it has become in the bigger scope, on the mainstream scope. And when I think about the idea of community and media, I look at also what we have and the tools that we have at our disposal to do that and to start re-engaging again. Because as we know, the idea of voting, the idea of being involved, necessitates being informed. It necessitates knowing what the issues are. It necessitates sharing information. It necessitates really engaging on a deeper level rather than kind of abdicating our power by voting and then sort of saying, that's it, I put my vote in and the politicians are out there and they're supposed to do what I hope they do, instead of going, well, that's one piece of it, but then what about our actual responsibility to make sure that happens and to understand when they're failing or when they need to be pushed or prodded and when we need to be pushed and prodded as well. So it's a sense of empowerment that I feel like we need to reclaim in terms of the concept of democracy overall. So that gets me to the community radio piece, because I've been a long admirer of the power of community radio. I think every social movement in the world, basically, as far as I know in modern times, has had and used independent radio, community radio, as a tool. Many revolutions, many social movements have had that as their crux, and still it's ongoing in many communities around the world. And often the case has been that these have been done, these stations, these endeavors have been done often with the risk of incarceration or worse, right? There's often been such limitations, and nonetheless people go ahead and do this because they know it's a powerful tool. And I think of the examples that I've seen in people and communities who've been fighting some pretty intense oppression, and they, despite the risks, will go out and try and engage and try and set up, whether clandestinely or otherwise, radio that will be able to communicate what's going on the ground, especially when there are no other alternatives. So we step back to here in our community, and we have this incredible resource, and we do not have the fear of incarceration or worse so far. Bill C-51 can kind of keep away. But we do have something that I think provides us with the opportunity to do that kind of reconnection to what democracy is. And it is one of those resources and tools that I think will become more and more relevant and more powerful as those aspects of media that people have sort of lost faith in really start to crumble down into a place of complete, just not unimportance, really. But at the same time, it requires engagement, right? One of the things that I wanted to do, because I don't know how many of you are actually familiar in depth with the nature of the radio station here, but it basically was revived from the hard work of a core group of people. And since it's sort of been revived, there's a number of amazing people involved doing amazing programming, some of which are in the room tonight, board members who are in the room tonight. And I wanted to give you just a quick lowdown of some of the programming that's there, just so you can get a taste of what I think is community democracy in action, really, which is shows that explore the history of the Tla'amin Nation in relationship to the colonial history of this area, language, indigenous language, the concepts of zero waste, living radically in rural areas, wild salmon. There's a whole show about wild salmon, which I think is awesome. Hockey, of course, so just to show that it really taps into what's really happening here as well in many ways. Music that you really wouldn't hear very many other places. Plant knowledge, ecology. We're talking information about books that you probably wouldn't hear about otherwise, or films, or festivals. Information that is coming from not only here, but from elsewhere across Canada, ground wire that speaks to what's going on across Canada independently. Democracy Now! Gets broadcast. So all of these things, and when you hear them all kind of listed, I go, wow, this is to me an example of plurality. These are the voices that don't get heard in the mainstream media. These are the voices and the opinions and the news and the expressions that we need to hear, not only to inform ourselves, but to engage ourselves and actually become active in our community and elsewhere, and understand where we are at and what the good things that are happening as well. So what I want to do, if anything, is really to exhort anyone who is, the only way that these tools and resources can flourish and work is if actually we engage in them, right? So community radio needs community. So if you don't have a membership, please get a membership. If you don't listen to it, try and tune in whenever you can. If you do, tell people about it. The idea of spreading it out into the corners that may not know about it already is key as well. Volunteer. There's so many possibilities you can do. Also, thinking about what you can offer. I mean, do you have ideas for shows? I mean, how beautiful is it that you have a platform that's there for you, that you can actually be supported to actually express things that are important to you as well. If you want to start a news show, if you want to get out there and be a journalist, a local citizen journalist, these are all possibilities that are here. And I think sometimes we can kind of not necessarily feel what the potential is in those things, especially when we can get so weighted down by the dismal landscape that we're facing on so many levels. But I've seen it firsthand. I've seen how when people get involved in these things, when they actually are building community through radio, it has quite a domino effect. And so this is the thing. I think these are the alternatives that I think we're needing right now desperately. And so the only way they will work is if we all engage in them on some level. There are people here from CJMP that will be giving you more information and being open to collecting more memberships. But again, it's also that it's only with the support of the community that these things can flourish. So I'm just going to end on that. Actually, no, I'm just going to end on the fact that one of my favorite poet, journalists, investigators of life, Eduardo Galeano, just died. And his legacy was really one of listening to what the truth is, listening to what's happening on the ground, and no matter what, being able to communicate it through poetry, through story, through fact, through any means that he had. And I think that's the kind of legacy which is interesting because the CBC didn't say anything about it, his death, until I had to search carefully in the news anyway. But I think that's the legacy that we really need to understand and feel right now, is that this is a critical time. We all know this. And so the more entry points we have into engaging into our true living democracy through any kind of communication source, we have to engage in it right now. We have to. I don't think there's any other choice. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. open it for to questions to anybody who wants to bring up an issue or ask a question to any of the people who've spoken here today. Murray.
No, I'm just gonna get a chair for Kai so we could,
Okay.
help him.
Provocative to say. Kai, take your own chair. Ellen.
I think sometimes we forget that the CBC was founded by conservatives, and that the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, at the time said that the airwaves are too special a public resource to be polluted by crass commercialism. So, you know, you had someone who was on that side of the political spectrum, but who saw the value of investigative journalism and of a non-commercial media. So I don't want to say those were the great old times, because that was the Depression. So, you know, we can't harken back to this being, you know, the ideal time. But you did have sort of enlightened leadership on media issues. And I just wondered, where is that kind of leadership now?
Well, you can use this if we want. To nuance that, they were also worried about American influence. So the creation of the CBC was partly a cultural project to prevent Canada from being annexed, basically culturally and eventually politically, by the US. So there was a nationalist impulse behind the creation of the CBC as well. But you're right, and there are still a lot of people on all sides of the political spectrum that appreciate a good debate, a good discussion, evidence-based policy, democracy, public consultation, and a lot of those people have really had to bide their time in recent years and watch that conversation degrade. So I don't think that it's just progressive people or left-wing people at all who are worried about the overall state of public media or the democratic conversation. I think there's lots of disaffected, alienated conservative people who probably share a lot in common with the conservative folks who supported creating a public broadcaster. Is anyone else?
Trish, does anybody else want to contribute to that?
I'm learning.
Okay, Trish?
I just one comment and one question. My comment is that Murray Dobbin came up with an expression that I love, and it's called the intentional citizen. And when you were talking, Claudia, it brought it to mind, because I think that's what we have to be. That's part of the democracy. We can't just suck it in. We have to be intentional citizens in our lives, and I think that helps the discussions and everything else. Pay attention to what's happening. But I have my question is concerns the CBC as well, and for quite a while, a long time, the advertisement on CBC about the programming said, "We bring you the news that you need to know," and that's pretty much a quote. That's changed just recently. They don't do that anymore. They're now saying, "We have these discussions and we're hearing you," and I'm just wondering what is bringing on, this is fairly recent, what is bringing on this change, and what do they feel they're going to accomplish by that?
Claudia, do you want to jump in?
Well, I would have an opinion about that. I mean, my sense of the NDP is, or sorry, the NDP, the CBC, is that it's kind of in the state of struggle, right? I mean, they've changed, as far as I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been a huge shift in the board membership and the directives, and you know, the death by 1,000 cuts, and I feel like, you know, it's suffering under that and trying to grasp whatever it can, like you mentioned before, you know, the idea that, you know, it's trying to keep the furniture in the room, right? So my sense of it is that there's just this desperate grasp of like, what can we do to keep people watching, and what can we do to keep people on rather than have the resources, the time, and the energy to go deeper into how can we salvage what we've been losing. It feels like, you know, they're just trying to plug the holes. That's my feeling right now.
And this is at a time when all the good journalists are leaving, the real journalists, and we're just left with mouthpieces.
So if I understand the premise of your question, there's been a branding shift basically between we have some confidence in our own editorial and we're going to tell you some stuff versus we don't really know, just tell us what you want. Is that basically the shift? So I think there's two things at play. One is a trend within the radio world towards sourcing things from listeners and community members, i.e. customers, because there aren't resources to go and gather that material themselves. So you'll see the rise of user-generated content. They call it UGC because everything has an acronym in the media world. And basically, if you can talk about something that somebody posted on your Facebook page, that fills airtime that you don't have to actually spend reporting the news. So that's one of the trends. But they're also, I think, sincerely trying to figure out, they are at a crossroads, as Claudia says, and they're trying to figure out what kind of a news organization they're going to be with a lot less money and a lot more competition for people's attention. And so they are, I think, trying to figure out, what kind of a relationship people want to have with the public broadcaster. Do you want to just do the dishes and they play whatever they want? Or do you want to have some input since you pay for the content? And I think that's a good impulse. It's just maybe they're not phrasing it in a way that makes any sense to you.
Yes. One of the origins of democracy was the marketplace in Greece, and people would come together and have conversation. And this may sound really strange, but there's a Facebook page called PowellRiver Swap and Shop, and it's a really strange place because it has become an idea swap and shop kind of place too. And when there was a teacher strike, for example, there were hours and hours of discussion, and it was fantastic because there was, people were rude, people had ideas that were completely contradictory to somebody else's, and it was such a really alive conversation. I feel we really lack that kind of forum. I mean, I really applaud what CGFP is doing, but it was wonderful, and I think we missed that kind of opportunity for really good discussion, community discussion. It's not a question, I guess.
Do you ever go on Texada Island news that travels faster than Texada Island time? Something like that? It's a really awesome site too, where you really see the sense of community in Texada Island. Like if anybody needs a ride anywhere, honestly, within 3-4 minutes, somebody's jumped down and said, I'll pick you up at this corner or whatever. But there was a plane crash there the other day, and within minutes it was like broadcast from all ends of the island. And so check that site out too, because there's a real sense of community, and they talk a lot and have discussions about the importance of what they're doing on Texada Island. I find it really enlightening.
Okay.
I was just going to comment that, and maybe have some ideas about it too. The old-fashioned idea of town halls. I don't know. I come from the States originally, so but I've been here for a while. So town halls was a real community thing that people would do, and there'd be a panel like this, and people would come and just talk like this. I really appreciate PowellRiver Voice is getting this together, because this is the opportunity that we have to get together, see other people and hear other ideas. So, that's the kind of thing that I've always missed, is that town hall idea where people really get together face to face and get to say what they think and listen to what other people think.
If I may, I think that actually links up to the previous comment, because what we're talking about is excuses to get face-to-face with people, right? And commerce was one before eBay. You actually had to take your donkey down to the market and trade the grain for the oil or the copper or whatever. And so the marketplace was an excuse to have face-to-face conversations, and that's where those ideas transferred. This whole evening would have been much more boring if it was an email chain where I wrote out like a 1,500-word diatribe, and then everybody just commented on the thread, and then we all just sort of sat there and scrolled through and read what everybody had to say, right? There's a utility to these online technologies, and maybe this is blasphemy coming from somebody who works at an organization that does so much online work, but I see that just as really an excuse to get people face to face. And so a lot of our work at Dogwood Initiative is taking people who find out about us online and basically getting them to the point where they will come and actually have a human conversation with a real person offline. And so Dave in the checkered shirt at the back does this every weekend, right? Just forcing people to go out and have conversations with strangers. And it's just something we're not really accustomed to doing anymore. And it's not something that you can substitute with a Facebook thread. Showing up on your neighbor's doorstep and ringing the doorbell and saying, hey, I want to have a conversation about democracy is terrifying the first 300 times you do it, if you've ever had to go door-to-door canvassing. But it can be kind of addictive too, because you realize that how often do you actually get to do that? How often do you get to have a conversation with somebody else about values and abstract important things, on a rainy doorstep? And so we are a big fan of using the internet to facilitate offline conversations, and I think that there's a lot of venues for that. And if the Swap and Shop is one of them, then huzzah! That's a great thing, I think.
So that's what I mentioned when I was speaking, in that, now a lot of times it's someone in a dark room with a computer, and you don't have that face to face, and it's being a substitute. But is that really where we want to go? So when you come to an evening like this, there's a lot of things that you don't see in an email thread. You can't hear your voice or see your eyes, or feel the passion that Claudia has when she talks about the radio. So it's still like very important, but I'm wondering if we're starting to lose that as a society. And also when you're not face to face, when you're in that dark room with your computer, perhaps you have your light on, but then there's a lot of anger that comes out, and there seems to be people who are angry, and you're not really going to accomplish anything if you're living your life in anger or in doom and gloom. And really, human beings are social animals, and I think that we accomplish a lot more even if we disagree. And I like to debate, and I like people to challenge my ideas, and I like them to come up with ideas that I might not have thought about before. Not everybody feels that way, but I think it's really important to have that person-to-person dialogue, as Kai said.
Maureen.
One of the things that I've noticed is that there's been an increase in the will of people to get together and have conversations. I'm seeing a shift there. What I'm not seeing is the skill to have those conversations so that we don't perpetuate a culture that's polarized. We go into this new situation with old habits. And the habits that we have now is we go in and we say, I think. So immediately you defend your position. Rather than asking questions that are truly about exploring possibilities. It's not about defending a position. And we've gotten ourselves as a society so ingrained in that pattern, when really the truth and the answer and the exploration is in the middle of all of our I thinks. And so it almost, for me, requires a different set of social skill. How do you ask questions that are really open and exploratory? How do you open a space for another idea without judgment? We're not very good at that, and we can get together for many town hall conversations, and until we start to really examine the subtleties of the way we interact, there's a limit to where that can go. And I'm just wondering where the media would be around those issues, because it seems to me that that would be, I don't know.
Well, I was just going to say in relationship to what the last question was, which I think is related to what you're saying as well, is that what I've noticed and observed is when there's been opportunities for people to come and share factual information about an issue. For example, there were people coming to do information about the LNG exploration and development, or the tankers, and coming with specific information. And there was, an opportunity for there to be dialogue. I think it also speaks to the fact that people would rather than just necessarily base everything on what they're reading, actually hear from people directly who do have that expertise and knowledge, and are able to actually engage and actually find out who else cares about, like who else is in the room that cares about these issues, and then organize, because that was the next step, right? But I do think that what you're speaking to is also something that I've also considered in terms of the sort of disappearance of venue for debate, and I think even the evolution of debate, of enlightened debate. So often, even within the context of political, and campaigning, it's like that's kind of just disappeared. Everything has become rote and very specific, and there's very little opportunity for people to engage on that level. And I come from a family of debaters, so I kind of miss that. But what you're identifying, I think, is somehow reflected often in some ways that I see very different contexts. I've worked with facilitators who work a lot with young people, and they always establish a set of community rules before you engage in conversation. And it's funny because I think about that and I go, why is this limited to these educational spaces with young people? It should be everybody, that we should all understand what do we actually want to engage in and how do we do it respectfully? How do we actually listen? Because I think we've lost those skills, like you say, along the way. So to me, it's sort of getting back to how do we actually absorb the information in such a way where we're really listening and we're really able to have a conversation, a dialogue, and a debate, and disagree, but do it in a productive way, right? So to me, that goes back to my little diatribe about the radio, is that by hearing all these voices, by having spaces where people can do that on air, can, I think, necessarily lead to spaces to do in other venues too. So these are incremental, obviously, but I think they're important. So thanks for bringing that up.
So just to continue on about the debate, because I did a lot of debating in school and also in communication training, and the best thing about participating in a debate is when you have to defend something that you do not believe in. And that's the great training in debate, because it really flips your thinking around. And so when I did communication training and set up debates, it was always the best thing to make sure that the person who had to defend a stand had to defend the one they did not actually believe in.
Well, you can see that in the House of Commons any given day.
There's no debate in the House of Commons.
So let's talk about the architecture of the House of Commons. Speaking of productive conversations, when is the last time you had a productive conversation from 30 feet away, surrounded by a baying horde of your best friends all pounding on the table, and you're like, ah! As you shouted at somebody on a time limit, right, before you then had to sit down. When's the last time that ever resulted in any kind of constructive dialogue? So if we're talking about electing our best and brightest, paragons of I'm not going to finish the sentence, to sit in the People's Assembly and make the biggest decisions, the most important decisions about the future of our country, maybe we need to switch up the seating arrangements.
Yeah.
And further to that, maybe we need to set up an electoral system that doesn't reward that kind of behavior. Because right now, the incentive is if you can tear a 5% chunk off of that person, and you can still squeak through with 36, 37% of the vote, that's enough to hold your seat for the next 4 years. That's enough to have enough votes to move forward your agenda. So that's not about constructive conversation or dialogue. And so I've heard some stats from much smarter people than I who study other voting systems around the world that talk about the quality of dialogue, and there are ways to measure the amount of law that actually gets passed and the progress along a number of indicators in these societies where they don't have a first-past-the-post voting system. So I think that there are ways to set up that conversation, that dialogue, to ensure that it will fail. And the US House of Representatives and the Canadian Parliament are two pretty good examples. And then there are other ways to set up that forum that actually reward and incentivize good behavior, the kind of conversation you're talking about. So the last thing I'll say is that in the meantime, don't be afraid to pick up the phone and talk to your candidate or your friend or the person you volunteered for and say, I support you, but I really don't like you just going on the attack or grandstanding or displaying this kind of excessive partisanship. It really turns me off as a voter, and I don't think it gains you any new support. If you can at least just tell people sometimes, and the closer your relationship, the better. I've watched that have positive effects on the behavior of politicians, but sometimes they just need somebody to wrap their knuckles.
Rob, and then Greg.
I just have to say I'm a great appreciator of our local media. And I truly, deeply believe that where we can be successful is in community. I'm very appreciative of the community that the Tyee clearly has around it. And I'm not really aware of any other news source that I trust more than the Tyee right now, as far as representing a fairly broad picture. I mean, it's becoming my alternative to CBC. I still do listen to CBC, and there's still some good stuff on CBC, but the fluff factor is sure increasing. But to get back to community, I guess I have a question, probably to you, Tyler, any of you, or Kai. If you know of any other source other than the Tyee, I do hugely appreciate Dogwood and a whole bunch of other specific organizations that serve specific purposes and give us really great information right along those specific lines, and that's really where my information is coming from. Aside from what is available here in this community, and CJMP is another huge one. As Claudia says, what's available on CJMP is terrific. It's where my car radio is on when I'm riding or driving the car, but I'm mostly on my bicycle, so it doesn't work all well either. I really believe in community, and we have a great community in Powell River capable of working together. If anything is going to move us forward in society in terms of thriving or even survival, I totally believe this is what it's about. And so what Dogwood's doing, what the Tyee is doing, and a few others. Are there others? There are.
Thoughts? Favorites?
Well, I read Vancouver Observer. I don't know if anybody else is familiar with that. It's a pretty good news source. Can you suggest something else?
Honestly, I just follow individual writers and reporters. And sometimes they jump from one publication to the next, but I find writers that I like or people whose integrity I respect. Chantal Hébert at the Toronto Star. There's a couple folks in French that, I'll just make a Google alert for that columnist or that journalist and see what they're covering in a given week.
Right. Even though I don't read The Sun, I read Stephen Hume all the time.
Yep.
Mark Hume. I've even read Christy
Blatchford.
in the last, because the Mike Duffy trial, she's just been so funny. It's been like, I laughed my head off a few days ago, so I've been going back to her every day just for a little bit of laughter.
Talk about a journalist turning.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, try the Vancouver Observer. That's a pretty good newspaper.
Greg?
Also, I was just going to mention there's lots of indie media. Like indie media has been doing a ton of work for a long time online, and they have citizen journalists that go out and do a lot of amazing work and often risk their lives to do so. So I would look up them as well. And then I just wanted to also mention, because we're talking about what's out there, that this is very exciting, but the CJMP is actually going to expand its broadcast zone with a new antenna very soon. So the range that currently exists will be multiplied many folds, which is awesome, which means that there will be a broader range. So when you start driving south of town or north of town, you can keep listening, which is always, when it starts to fade, you go, oh. So yes, it's also streams online, but this is a very great thing. I just wanted to mention that.
One other thing, if you get a chance, if you can watch Al Jazeera News, it's an excellent channel, and they put a huge amount of resources into some really excellent documentaries that you won't see anywhere else.
I'm going to revise my statement. Watch, listen, and read to everything you can get your hands on, actually. There are specific people that I trust, and then there's other people that I think it's important just to know what they're up to.
Yes.
Like my old friend Ezra.
Greg?
It's one thing to be informed, and you talked about the information, and you talked about what the journalists can do to that information to make it palatable. but the whole flow of the way things have gone tonight has just been tremendous for me. Because you can try to keep yourself informed. The big problem is trying to keep yourself from going into deep depression from everything you're reading, all of the things going wrong, and not that much interest, i.e. market, i.e. profit, in the good news part of it. And so on. Suzuki's starting to change a little bit of that. But the historical perspective in here, just very quickly, it used to be just getting the information. You know, where are the garage sales going to be? What's the price of grain next week, and so on. So historically, it was just a source of facts that you could get. But we seem to have gone through a few years of evolution here right now, and I think all of us can appreciate that. Deep down, we know that the communities, the country has to totally develop a new vision. It has to totally develop the way they do things, how they're going to reward each other, et cetera, et cetera. We know this has to happen, and that's exactly what came out on the board tonight, and that's what I got from each one of you as we came through. It's not about getting facts. It's not about, in effect, just the journalistic reporting. It's about how do we help the communities redefine themselves, and how do they redefine their own vision of what they want and how they're going to get there. That seems to be the bottom part right now. And then trying to separate the media from the democracy becomes it's kind of a non-question right now. It's this undercurrent of drive to redefine that. How does the community go about redefining itself? How does the community dialogue with each other to achieve that? So anyway, thanks very much. It's been tremendous to see that undercurrent happening through all of the different aspects of media that you represent.
Okay, I've got two more hands at the moment. I've got you, and I've got after that.
My name is Corey Matsumoto. I had an independent media publication called Imminence Magazine. It started in 2007. And the first issue, I went out, gathered about $2,400 in advertising revenue to kick it off. Just happened to be at the time when the mill was, there was some controversy over the landfill extension in Wobblet. And there was the next issue had some letters. I think one was written by me.
Corey, I can't hear you.
Okay, yeah, so my question is, after there was our second issue, we had a problem with being blacklisted on the mill. This was verified by Google search. There was a list of businesses that were blacklisted because they were advertising in Imminence. And Imminence Magazine was publishing letters that were opposing, not just my own, but others, opposing the landfill expansion. Coincidentally, there was also Patricia Holbrook's publication called, what was it called again? It was
Watchdog.
Was it the Watchdog? And then one of the headlines was like, close the mill. So we were kind of branded under that same kind of banner as like an anti-mill publication. So our very next issue following that, our advertising revenues dropped by half. I was barely able to keep the magazine going. So it took a lot of convincing and a lot of talking to businesses to like keep the support going, and we did keep surviving for another until 2012. But I was just wondering what your thoughts are specifically with the Joyce movie, because you have the most experience, or anyone, I guess Drew, you're also funded by advertising. My question is, have you had any experiences similar to that, where you find that your advertising revenue stream is compromised by content, and how you dealt with that, and if it's
Yes. So when we started the peak, so we came back. I've been actually, Gulf Islands Driftwood is the newspaper on Salt Spring Island.
Right.
So when it came back and started the Peak, the newspaper that was already here, that Wendy and I both worked for, was a union newspaper. And so the Labor Council sent out a directive to all its members not to advertise or read or have anything to do with the Peak. There was quite a nasty letter circulated, and what I did was I contacted the president of the Labor Council and asked her to come to my office so that we could have a conversation. And I said, I know that you wrote that letter, and it's not true, the information that's included in the letter, and you didn't even have the courage to sign the letter. So that went on for a while. So we faced that. And one of the, where my husband worked, some people from the union came in and threatened the place where my husband worked as well. So yeah, I've been there. And the irony of that whole thing is, when I worked at the PowellRiver News, I was the union shop steward. And I knew all about the union. My old union brothers from Vancouver actually came into the Peak office and told me that I should start a union at the Peak. And I just looked at them and I said, you know how unions started. Unions were a product of bad management. So if there's not bad management, there's not really a reason to have a union. So I know what you're talking about.
I haven't had that problem because I'm not really making any money off my newspaper. My business partner in the Okanagan has found for him that content isn't all that important because the advertisers just want to get their ads out there, and they haven't really scrutinized any of the articles that he's written or his reporter writes. And for a little tiny town, he's got an awful lot of an awful lot of advertising. So it almost feels sometimes that you can either be a really good journalist and have people mad at you for the content that you're writing about, or just like put almost like pulpy pap on your site. And the advertisers don't care because it's an avenue to get their ads out to the consumer. So somewhere in between, I guess. You want to write good stuff and appeal to people and have them advertise on your site. I'll let you know when I get there.
Yet another reason to have independent community radio, because there is no advertising, and therefore all the programming can be done independently without fear of these issues that you brought up. And but again, it doesn't need to be supported by membership, of course. But this is important, having an independent space where it's not as the profit motive isn't the reason or the need to keep it going. It's something that we need to have as an independent media space.
Maybe I just need to have a bunch of sponsors then.
Okay.
Have a membership, right?
I got one more question here, and I'd like maybe at the end for everybody to have time to have another cup of coffee and actually talk to each other too about the experience of the evening, and maybe individually to the speakers. So I do think, how many hands, who else has got something to say? The lady there is already on the list. And then I think we could wrap it up. There is a petition from the Sierra Club at the back about climate change for anybody who's interested. That's the only advertisement. Yes.
I think it's clear from people made various different suggestions of where you can find out news or other opinions or so on. And I think it's true that if you're a news junkie like I am a little bit, and obviously you as journalists are, you can find information just about anywhere. And if I think the Vancouver Sun, for example, is terrible on international news, but you can go and read The Guardian or Al Jazeera online, and you'll find out stuff if you're really looking for it. But in the old days, when we all read the same evening newspaper that came to our door, there was a sort of common body of information that everybody was kind of exposed to. And I think there's some kind of loss about that. It worries me sometimes that we don't have a chance to have, if you're having that conversation or that debate in the community, that people are not always dealing with the same set of assumptions or dialogue. One thing that really bothers me in our country is that we get absolutely no information out of Quebec, and I don't speak French, so I can't just go online and read the French newspapers. And I know that there's a lot of stuff going on there, and it's never reported in the English national press or on the CBC or anything. And I suspect that it's true the other way around, that Francophone people in Quebec are hearing absolutely nothing that goes on in BC. And I think that that's a huge political problem, that when different communities are completely isolated from each other and in their own silo. We talk about young people having different sources than those of us who are more comfortable with print and so on, but and so I'm wondering if there's, as journalists, how do you address that question? Like, how do you find out what's going on in Quebec or other parts of the country?
Top story tonight out of Quebec.
Sorry?
The top story on the news tonight's out of Quebec.
The Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, Supreme Court decision.
Jean Tremblay is he's an amazing kook. I had the privilege of interviewing the mayor of Saguenay, the guy that likes to pray before the council meetings. If you have to use it, Google Translate is one tool that doesn't give you a perfect translation, but gives you kind of a rough idea of what's going on so that you can then enter some of those key phrases and try to dig up some writing. There's a site called Ricochet that is bilingual, English-French, with an office in Montreal. It's it's a progressive, I'd say it's a left-wing online news site, but they cover a lot of the student marches and the anti-austerity stuff, and they translate all of their stuff into French and English. And there are still, I would say, some good, there's a lot of friends of mine who still work for the CBC in English in Montreal, but you'd have to go to the English CBC site for the city of Montreal, and then there's podcasts and local news articles that obviously you wouldn't get out here. But
in terms of democracy, you see, that's just another going down more layers of the onion to find information. The vast majority of people in Canada are not going to do that. So if there's not a more mainstream media outlet that's covering that stuff, that's a problem for democracy, I think. If people in other regions don't care about tankers, if only people in BC care about tankers, and if that kind of thing.
well, specific to that, the opposition to the Energy East pipeline is directly inspired by British Columbia, and they've borrowed a bunch of our campaign tactics and messaging that we borrowed from them in the first place. So when you talk to people in Quebec about BC, their eyes go wide and they're like, oh my goodness, Wales, the Canucks, and you guys have been just embarrassing the federal government for the last 9 years on Northern Gateway, so way to go. Those are the conversations I have every time I go back there. So they've heard about it one way or another. But you're right, I think the public broadcaster is the only outlet that has a mandate to represent Canada back to the people of Canada in both official languages and 7, 8, 9 Indigenous languages as well. And so if we don't have funding for that, as I said earlier, there's no incentive for the private networks to fill that gap if people don't know that it's missing. And so I think that when you're talking about national news and especially stuff out of Quebec, the public broadcaster really has to set the standard, and then other organizations will produce content to compete with that. But if it's gone, and if we just cut the CBC, then I guarantee you'll hear less about Quebec.
Okay, I really want to wrap this up because I'd really like to have people to chance to talk to each other. You're nodding because we've got one last question here. And I would really like to thank everybody for coming. I think it's been a really informative and entertaining discussion that we've all had, and I'd like to thank the participants very much for coming too.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you said that, Todd, because that's what I wanted to say. There's a lot of good questions tonight and how we can advance democracy. And I'm not sure if everybody agrees with me, but the more cuts that come to CBC, the more creative they get. And it just goes to show how important CBC really is for, this is in my view anyways, how important it is for us and our country. And I learned so much from CBC, from when I was a kid, my parents would have it playing all the time. And I learned so much about our country and about democracy and about our voice. And it's very disruptive to me and discouraging to see how these cuts keep going on and on. And back to Corey, if you guys remember that great cartoon that the cartoonist from the Vancouver Sun put on the internet of the oil splashing onto the Kinder Morgan's ad, and how that triggered that company to threaten to quit spending $1 million of advertising with the Vancouver Sun. And the Vancouver Sun pulled that ad. And right there, I felt that was a real threat to democracy.
They also fired Dan Murphy.
And they fired him as well?
Yeah.
Okay, so
It was a few months later, but he had made himself persona non grata at the province. So he was let go.
That again, another reason that we need to have a voice, And it's great, this debate or this discussion tonight, and I just hope that people will do whatever they can to support the CBC and to let Mr. Harper know that it is such an important integral culture and method of getting our voice out and telling our story, right? Because Mr. Harper's story is tainted, and it's not our story. And so I just hope that everybody donates and really fights for CBC.
I hope everybody has a cookie before they go on. Okay, Murray.
No, I don't have a question. I just want to say if people are interested in these kinds of events, the sign-up sheet, I hope if you sign up the Our Voices sign-up sheet, we'll be sure to inform you the next time we...
Yeah, and the very last thing I'll say is you're in a new riding this year. There's been a lot of changes. Your current MP is not running again in this riding. So there's new candidates from all the parties. Well, I'm not asking. All that to say, Dogwood Initiative is going to be surveying those candidates. We're going to be putting those answers online, and we're also going to be running independent polling in these ridings so that you have a sense of the horse race and how the campaigns develop over the next 6 months. So if you're interested in those updates, Dave is at the back of the room, and if you sign up for our email mailing list, we'll keep you abreast of what's happening locally as much as possible, including space for updates from local news outlets as well. We're trying to customize the experience in each of the 42 federal ridings to that riding so that people get content tailored to the place where they live. So we're working on that, and it'll be live in the next few weeks.
Thanks, you guys.
And don't forget to get your CGMP membership.
CGMP membership.
Well, awesome. Nice to meet you after the fact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I talk so much.
No. I invited you to talk. Here's my card. From out of town. And from Dogwood Initiative. It's so important.